Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. A forum to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. In our bid to think critically, not cynically, let's dive right in.
Act 1, the mainstream media.
The so-called 21st century intellectual, whether on the left or on the right, has agreed on one thing, that there is a common boogeyman, and that is the mainstream media. The mainstream media has political bias against a party, against a politician, against a social issue, against a religious sect. It isn't that we have any of these biases, it's that the mainstream media is focusing on their biases and giving us a skewed, a flawed representation of the world. The mainstream media today is very similar or akin to the mainstream media 100 years ago. I like to talk about history on this podcast. Let's talk about the history of the mainstream media. 100 years ago, media was very tightly controlled by a few individual tastemakers, so to speak. Given the limit in the mediums that were available to the public, namely newspapers, but now in the infancy, radio, very powerful interests could control the entirety of the mainstream media landscape. I made reference in a previous podcast to Disney and how it is structured and what its goals and motivations are, and the media is no different. The media is an industry. It is a business. Businesses exist to make profit. Therefore, media is going to be centered on what it can produce in order to not only make profit, but to increase profit. Get people's attention, keep people's attention, keep them coming back. Too few people know the story, but William Randolph Hearst, one of the most influential publishers that ever lived, and by the way, a genius, changed the way media was presented to the public. It made his publications wildly popular, and it made him a millionaire several times over, and one of the most powerful media influences in his day. What did he do, dear listener? Did he take his hard-earned money and invest in journalism, in in-depth reporting on policy issues, of stories of great importance of the day? Were his media outlets a watchdog for state and federal government? Did his publications hold politicians accountable? No. No. Hearst, although he was likely not the first publisher to do so, popularized sensationalism and human interest stories. He sensationalized news stories, stories where the facts weren't necessarily going to get in the way of a great story. No better example of this than his sensationalism of the alleged atrocities committed by the Spanish in Cuba in 1897, 1898 that led to the Spanish-American War. That is all a tactful, that is all a G-rated way to say the man made shit up in newspapers, passing themselves off as legitimate news outlets. He incorporated the National Enquirer. He incorporated TMZ. Don't let any baby boomer fool you. Don't let any of these people in popular culture, in these social media echo chambers, try and convince you that the human interest story, the focus on the individual, the hero or the victim mentality that pervades the current media landscape is somehow a new phenomenon. It was pioneered by a man over 100 years ago, And it was so successful and so popular that it actually got a derisive name that many people have heard, and they don't even know the source of it. They don't even know the advent of the term. It was called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is a term that was coined in the early 20th century for the sensational presentation of news, for the focus on human interest stories over actual journalism. In any discussion about the news media in the 21st century, let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the fact that nothing about the mainstream media today is unique or new or specific to the human condition in this day and age. This is an old story. Same song, different verse. And what is the point of it all? The point of it all is to make money. Get your attention, keep your attention. Although we like to hold ourselves out as being so much more sophisticated than people 100 years ago. Yellow journalism is as successful today as it was 100 years ago. As I said in an earlier episode of the podcast, we don't vote for credible, legitimate, honest people for public office. We vote for idiots. Although we want to believe that we have discriminating tastes and that we are dying for information, that we are out there actively seeking the news. We don't want news. We want yellow journalism. We want to vote for idiots, and we want to watch idiots. That's what we get in the mainstream media. News actors. Not journalists. News actors. The people you see on the television screen, the people that you see in these news clips on your phone, spent more time on their hair, their makeup, and their clothes than they did researching any story that they're speaking about. Just like many of our politicians, they are actors playing a role. Why is it this way? Because that is what we want. The mainstream media is giving us what we want. I look at the mainstream media and I see it no different than I do the marketplace for restaurants. There are thousands of choices in dining out. Even in rural areas, the number of choices that you have if you want to dine out has proliferated, has risen greatly over the course of the last 20 years. By way of traffic, by way of money, by way of consumption, where do people want to go to eat? That's right. Fast food. McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, Jack in the Box. Millions and millions served every day. If you've got any dignity and self-respect, you know that that food is slop. It's pig slop repurposed to look like human food. It is crammed full of salt and sugar in order to give you a brief but satisfactory high that you will then need to come back in short order and fulfill again. The average American has become so blind to this that a tribalism has arisen out of which news outlet you watch, you follow, you subscribe to. You can argue to me that Fox News is better than ABC News, is better than NBC News, is better than CBS News. You can argue to me that McDonald's is better than Burger King, that it's better than Wendy's, that it's better than Jack in the Box. All you've done is convince me that you're an asshole. There is no better. It's simply the best of the worst. The least bad. And when you think about the least bad, you think about 24-hour cable news networks. Employing the fast food analogy, 24-hour cable news networks are all like Jack in the Box. Think about it. Jack in the Box is a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week operation. You can go to Jack in the Box at 6:48 in the evening and get breakfast balls or breakfast sticks or whatever the hell they call them. You can go to Jack in the Box at 3:48 in the morning and get some excuse for a taco. Whenever you want it, Jack in the Box is open, available, ready to serve you. Let's reflect on that. What kind of food is served at Jack in the Box? It's already pig slop when it's coming out of the McDonald's drive-thru, of the Burger King drive-thru, of the Wendy's drive-thru. It's already pig slop. But think about what kind of pig slop it has to be in order to be available, ready for you to order at any time of the day, any day of the week. It is the lowest of the fucking low of human consumption. And that, dear listener, is exactly what 24-hour cable news networks are. The lowest of the low. The most putrid of the pig slop. Fox News, fucking slop. MSNBC, fucking slop. CNN, fucking slop. Again, think about it. And let's think critically, not cynically. Who goes to Jack in the Box? You don't need to think about this. They tell you. Jack in the Box tells you by way of their advertising who their target market is. It's teenagers and young people probably between the ages of 19 and 35 under the influence of either alcohol or drugs that want to be satiated in that very limited moment. I'm drunk. I'm high. I want slop. I seek slop. Old Jack there, leaning up against the door of the restaurant. Come on in. Got plenty of slop for you. You want a taco? I can give you this poor excuse for a taco. You want a hamburger? I can give you this disgusting, squished, sorry, sad-looking excuse for a hamburger. Oh, you want French toast sticks? The name in and of itself is disgusting and speaks to the fact that it can't be a good food product. But we've got plenty of them. Dive right in. Now, let's take that and compare it to the type of person that's focused. Again, focused on 24-hour news network coverage. Oh, these are some dullards. These are not bright people. They like colorful things. They like graphs. They like pretty people talking in very terse tones. Watch the commercials, dear listener. Watch the commercials. Do you need a catheter? Do you have problems with cleaning out your sleep apnea machine? How many questions do you have about Medicare Part A and Part B coverages? Are you picking up on a theme? 24-hour cable news networks market to a target audience just like Jack in the Box markets to a target audience. Who can actually sit and watch 24-hour news networks for 12 hours a day, for 14 hours a day, for 16 hours a day? I'll take all the guesswork out of it for you. It's the elderly. It's the octogenarian. If you were below the age of 60 and you were watching 24-hour news networks on any kind of regular basis, I simply ask of you, what happened to you in high school? Where did things go wrong? So where does that leave us? We're asking for a product and we're getting that product. And the producer is providing us that product in order to make more and more money. Frankly, we're all happy with the arrangement. Everyone gets to go off in their tribe. They get to watch their mainstream media outlet. The dimmer among us will watch their 24-hour news outlet. And everyone's happy. But occasionally, the mainstream media is actually called on to report and investigate news. Fancy that. News outlets are occasionally put in the untenable position of having to meet their journalistic foundations, of employing people to go out and investigate what actually happened. What are the facts? What have we been told versus what is the truth? Well, by way of the fact that we rarely call on these outlets to do this, they're terrible at doing so. And yet, we don't blame ourselves for not demanding on a day-to-day basis a higher standard from them. We blame the mainstream media outlets. Again, we don't blame ourselves for not demanding anything more than yellow journalism of stupid, sensationalized stories and even stupider human interest stories. We blame the mainstream media outlet. Let's harken back to the fast food analogy. You walk into your local McDonald's and you approach the counter. The 17-year-old behind the counter turns to you and says, "Welcome to McDonald's. What would you like to order?" You respond as follows. "I'd like to start with the asparagus and tomato salad. That's gluten-free and vegan, correct? Great. For my second course, I'd like the Pacific mussels. I'd like a light lemongrass tomato broth. And please put the grilled bread on the side. I prefer not to have it in the bowl. I'd like as my entree the seared duck breast." Oh, that sounds fantastic. "And for dessert, naturally, I'd like the creme brulee with fresh berries." The 17-year-old stares back at you and says, "Some of our hamburgers have cheese on them." Who's the asshole? Who's the asshole in this scenario? The 17-year-old working at McDonald's standing behind a counter, or you? You go to McDonald's because you know what you're going to get at McDonald's. They have slop. You like slop. You're going to buy some slop. You walk in, you look up at a menu that is as basic and simple as any menu can be, and yet it still has designation of numbers next to the pictures of food items. You stomp out a 3 because you're just in that mood. You're going to get yourself that Big Mac. And the most complicated question you have to answer is, are you going to supersize it? That's what you get at McDonald's. You want it. It's been designed for you to get it, and you can go and get it, to my dismay, at practically every other corner on the face of this planet. Just because on occasion your palate may change, your level of sophistication may change, you can't go into McDonald's and demand of them a delicate, intricate 4 or 5 course meal. On every day of the week and twice on Sunday, we watch the news to see sensationalized bullshit. Attacks on our political rivals, on our social rivals, on our religious rivals. We watch to see some of the dumbest, most poorly produced and thought out human interest stories you could ever hope to see. Look at the man that taught his dog how to ride a skateboard. Look at the woman who has a cat that can play the piano. The biggest challenge to Hallmark and that sappy bullshit has been the 24-hour news networks. There is no bottom to that well. The mainstream media is made up of personalities, news actors. These are not journalists. They know how to get dressed up. They know how to pretty themselves. And for all intents and purposes, they're just flipping hamburgers. That's all they know how to do. When you call on them in a crisis, they're just going to continue to flip hamburgers. They don't have the capacity to create a delicate and intricate 4-course meal. They don't have the capacity to do any real investigative journalism. Again, they spend most of their time on hair, makeup, and clothes. That's what we want to look at. That's all we're going to get. And now let me submit this to you, because I believe this to be the truth. What if then these mainstream media news networks these 24-hour news networks, what if they took a turn? What if they did start investing in journalism and in-depth reporting of news stories? You want to know what would happen? The public would watch for 5 or 10 minutes and say, where's the slop? Where is the sensationalized nonsense? Where are these predictable, basic, stupid human interest stories? Where's the slop? I came here for slop. I'm going to get me some slop. And then they'd change the channel. The fact of the matter is, the real news is boring. It's methodical. It's meticulous. That's not what the public wants. They want a show where people are singing or dancing or both. Or they're doing both of those in a costume. They don't want the news. They want a bunch of people to get put together in a house in order to find their soulmate. And I'm sorry, dear listener, I can't avoid this. It's quick tangent time, and we've got to talk about The Bachelor. This is the dumbest fucking program on television. There's more fantasy involved in this program than there is in the Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, or Game of Thrones series all put together. Reality television show? A show where people are going on to find true love? People buy this stupid shit? There is routinely a highbrow pushback against fantasy genres. Fantasy television shows, fantasy movies. These are for the more unsophisticated palate. But if you pay attention, if you listen long enough, these critics with such a sophisticated palate will admit that they not only watch, but are huge fans of The Bachelor. Let's be clear. An elf, a Klingon, and a stormtrooper will marry harmoniously in a polyamorous relationship before any of these fuckwits on The Bachelor find true love. Give me a good story. Give me writing. Give me directing. Give me the actors and actresses that can pull it off. And I'll buy into a Lord of the Rings, a Star Wars, a Game of Thrones. But you want me to buy that a television network can find 10 narcissists to be thrown into a house together to find true love and then televise it? Bullshit. And the tangent ties in directly to the point about the mainstream media. Yes, it's broken. Yes, it's terrible. And yes, we wouldn't have it any other way. We can't create a demand sufficient for there to be a McDonald's on every other corner of every street in this country and then turn around and demand that McDonald's, when we so choose, start serving 4-course meals. That's not the way it works. Likewise, we can't demand of these mainstream media outlets so little in the way of news and journalism and then expect in a time of crisis that they can somehow turn the direction of that mighty ship and become the watchdog that we expect them to be. If we demand slop, and we will continue to pay for slop, all we're going to get is slop.
Act 2 Sports.
The men's Final Four is set. UCLA versus Gonzaga, Baylor versus Houston. After watching the Elite 8 games, it's clear that Gonzaga is the best team in the field. Because my brackets are a dumpster fire and I have no chance of winning any kind of money or competition by way of picks, I'm going to stick to the Baylor versus Gonzaga final, with Baylor pulling out the upset in the end and ruining the undefeated season. But rather than focus on the final, or even the Final Four, I have to go in depth on the UCLA-Michigan game. Because the Michigan Wolverines, in my mind, channeled the University of Tennessee Volunteers men's team, and over the course of the last 5 to 6 minutes of the basketball game against UCLA, developed what sports scientists refer to as tight asshole syndrome. What, you may ask, are signs, symptoms of tight asshole syndrome? Well, tight asshole syndrome is not specific to college basketball or basketball in general. Tight asshole syndrome affects many an athlete in many a sport. But specific to basketball, some of the common signs are taking round basketball and throwing it at the basket in the hopes that it will actually go into the basket. There is a term of art in basketball called touch. This is the ability to take round basketball and rather than throwing it violently at the rim, you place an amount of quote-unquote touch on the ball, thereby guiding it, helping direct by the use of athleticism, gravity, physics, the ball into the basket. The University of Tennessee Volunteers were a petri dish, a specimen, if you will, of tight asshole syndrome over the course of the 2020 to 2021 basketball season. If that team did not see the ball go into the basket for a 2 to 3 minute stretch, they began to press. Assholes began to clinch. Ball then became not an ally, but an adversary. And in this adversarial relationship, the players would then take the ball and violently throw it at the basket. As you may recall, dear listener, in an earlier podcast episode, I lamented the fact that the team seemed to make it one of the most difficult endeavors that human beings have ever undertaken to place round ball in round hole. The University of Michigan Wolverines scored 49 points against UCLA. That's it. Over the course of the entire basketball game, they scored 49 points. They missed their last 8 shots. Again, the University of Michigan Wolverines, the number 1 seed, missed their last 8 shots. Commentator, analyst, they'll go on their diatribe about how good UCLA's defense was. But in watching that game, Michigan simply threw the basketball as an adversary at the basket in the hopes that it would go into the basket. The ugliest word there is hope. They had no confidence that ball would go into the basket. They had turned that ball into an adversary, and they began throwing the ball at the basket. Tight asshole syndrome. Congratulations to UCLA. You play the teams that you play, and you are confronted with the situations that you are put in. Michigan simply couldn't score the basketball. I'm sure UCLA had something to do with that at different intervals, at different points of the game. But those last 8 shots, I would say at least 6 of them were good open looks that the player simply missed. And again, it did not look like any of the players on the floor had any confidence in shooting the basketball. Take round ball, throw it at round hole, hope for the best. I think it very likely that UCLA will lose to Gonzaga by over 20 points. Again, each team, any team, they only have to overcome the obstacles that are placed in front of them. It's not Gonzaga's fault that they haven't had the toughest road to reach the Final Four and now won't have the toughest road to actually reach the final. Juwan Howard is a great coach. Michigan will be back, but it just demonstrates that once tight asshole syndrome sets in, it is very difficult for any athlete to break out.
Act free cancel culture.
As someone who is older, slower, dimmer of wit, most viral news stories pass me by. But one was brought to my attention that I felt compelled to comment on. And that is the story about rapper Lil Nas X and the Satan shoes. Turns out this kid, who is a rapper, has teamed up with a company that has a penchant for creating marketing strategies that go viral quickly. In this strategy, the company buys a bunch of old Nike Air Jordans, slaps a pentagram on them, and claims that the ink used has a drop, an ounce, whatever it may be, of human blood. Story blows up, goes viral, and the Puritans see an opportunity. Puritanical figureheads, many of whom in the past have lamented cancel culture, condemn this marketing campaign, and of course, demand that it be canceled. What a lot of people don't realize about cancel culture is that it has existed since the early 80s. It was the religious right that actually pioneered cancel culture. When the so-called moral majority, the Christian right, really began to take a political stance in a public way in the early 1980s, part of that stance was the advent, the implementation of cancel culture. Jerry Falwell routinely spoke of things that were unchristian and that should be canceled. The interesting thing about sports, politics, religion, social issues, it really doesn't matter. The interesting thing is, in all of these aspects of life, once you introduce an idea into the social discussion, into the social lexicon, you don't get to control it. It's like a piece of art. Once it's created, it is often interpreted by the observer. The artist's intention, particularly over time, begins to fade. The Christian right, in its advocacy of cancel culture in the early 1980s, had no idea that they were opening Pandora's box in the way that they were, particular to the way cancel culture could develop in a society that was so heavily invested in social media. So here you have a situation where an artist teams up with a marketing company that's a social media tastemaker, so to speak, that is capable of creating something that goes viral very quickly. And you have the laughable paradox of those that lament cancel culture, again, embracing cancel culture. But this story has a twist, dear listener, and that's the reason why I wanted to bring it up on my podcast. And that twist is the true cancel culture. No, not petitioning people to stop buying a product or stop using a service. The real cancel culture is in the courts, is through the lawyers. Remember the Simpsons episode where Homer joins the movementarians? I love the leader. When Homer is abducted by his family out of the movementarian camp, what do the movementarians do? They unleash their deadliest weapon, the lawyers. Nike, it turns out, is suing this company that released this shoe because, one, Nike had no idea that this was actually being done to one of its products. Two, this company never got permission from Nike to remodel or refashion those Air Jordans. And three, and probably most detrimental to this company, Nike is claiming that it has negatively impacted its branding. You can talk about cancel culture. You can talk about offending the moral majority, the Christian right. But let's be clear. Jesus forgives, Nike doesn't. Let me sum up what's really happening here for you. As I've stated to you numerous times, old man, day late, dollar short, particularly on the memes, the social media viral memes. But I am aware of a situation where a social media influencer, I think the kid's name is Logan Paul, he was in Japan and ended up going to a place that had some kind of reputation for people committing suicide, and in fact had videoed a dead body, ostensibly someone that had committed suicide. Let me tell you, dear listener, that's all that's happening in this story. This story really isn't about cancel culture. It's about a company, a corporation, committing suicide in your very presence, in front of your very eyes. Nike is one of the biggest corporations in the world and one of the most recognizable brands. When Nike sues you for damaging the brand, Nike is suing you to death. One of the oldest forms of cancel culture is the lawsuit. You don't need the support of any puritanical group on the left or the right. You don't need to rally support on social media. The lawsuit will take care of all of that by itself. Truly, the greatest agent of cancel culture are the lawyers. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.